I called my wife while her lover was with her at the hotel. They were shocked. I already knew they were together. I already had all the proof, every detail, every lie she told me, every lame excuse, every night she pretended to be too tired to talk, to touch me, to look into my eyes. I knew. And still, I heard her voice shaking on the phone, trying to hide it, pretending that nothing was happening. The silence on the other end of the line was enough. The weight of betrayal dripped through the air like poison, as if she herself felt the cold blade of her own guilt pressing against her throat. But what they didn't know, was that I wasn't the man who would be humiliated in that story. I had already planned everything. I already knew exactly how this game would end. And it wouldn't be with me playing the fool. My heart beat in the rhythm of a contained storm. With every second that passed, I relived everything. The way she started to move away from me, as if I were a ghost inside our own house. The ridiculous excuses, the deleted messages on your cell phone, the strange perfume on your clothes, the showers that took too long, the way you started to get ready to go out, but without ever looking pretty for me. I noticed the furtive glances at the phone, the adrenaline sparkle in her eyes when he sent a message. I saw it. But she thought I didn't see. I thought she was deceiving me, that she could shape me, leave me in the shadows while she gave herself to another man. But I saw it. And I waited. I built my plan. While my wife whispered my name into the phone, pretending to be normal, pretending she wasn't naked, underneath another man, in a cheap hotel where I thought she would never be discovered, my mind worked. She thought this betrayal was a game where only she and he held the cards, but I was the one holding the rules of this game. I would turn the tables. Because betrayal has a price. And she wasn't prepared to pay it. I remember the exact moment I started to put the pieces together. The first suspicious message, the schedules that didn't match, the work meetings that never existed. I didn't confront, I didn't yell, I didn't beg. I just watched. I let her sink alone, to give herself more and more to her lover without even imagining that I was there, in control of everything. I knew that one day the perfect opportunity would arise. I knew that one day she would feel safe enough to make the fatal mistake. And that day arrived. The phone was on speakerphone. I wanted to hear the fear in her voice. The sound of the lover's silence in the background, completely static, trying to understand if they were really discovered. I could imagine the scene, both of them naked, bodies sweaty from a betrayal that no longer had any pleasure, just despair. She hesitated, and then laughed nervously, trying to sound casual. "Hi, love," his voice was sweet, forced. My stomach turned. How did she still have the courage to call me that? But I remained calm. I wouldn't give myself up. Not yet. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice filled with a calculated coldness. "Where are you?" She stuttered. He tried to improvise some lie, but it was weak. Pathetic. Every word that came out of her mouth sounded like shattering glass, like a house of cards collapsing. And the silence in the background, the silence of the other man, was confirmation that they knew they had been caught. They knew the game was over. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't just going to let them get away with a lame excuse and a fake apology. No. They would pay. And the price would be high. She tried to change the subject. Tried to wind me up. "Baby, why are you calling me so late?" But her voice was shaking, desperation was overflowing, and I savored every second of it. My silence was her torture. The lover said nothing. He was probably sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes wide, wondering whether he should run away or face the situation. But running away would be useless. There was nowhere else to run. I held back the laughter. She still thought she could reverse it. That he could control the narrative, manipulate me, convince me that it was all just a misunderstanding. But I already knew everything. I had the photos, the audios, the messages, the concrete evidence of her betrayal. But more than that, I had something she would never expect, my decision not to be the victim in this story. She thought I would suffer. That I would cry, that I would beg for explanations, that I would ask why. But the truth was, I was over it before I even picked up the phone and dialed his number. The only thing that kept me there, in that connection, was the desire to savor the exact moment in which his life would fall apart. The moment when she would understand that she would lose everything. And that I already had one foot out of this story. That I was ready to start over. And that, unlike her, I would still have something valuable at the end of it, my dignity. And something she could never get back, my love. Revenge would come. But not in a predictable way. Not in a cliché way. It would be calculated. Cold. Irreversible. And when she least expected it, she would realize that betrayal wasn't the worst mistake she made. Her worst mistake was believing that I wouldn't know how to get back on my feet. That I would stay there, stuck, mourning, while she and her lover moved on. But I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be a broken man. I would be a free man. And the cruelest irony? She would realize this at the very moment she realized it was too late. And the lover? He would also have his part in the game. Because when you choose to get into a cheating story, you need to be prepared for the consequences. And the consequences were coming. One by one. The game was just beginning. But only I knew how it would end. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not romanticized, and will never be justified. Our stories are fictional, but the pain, impact and consequences of infidelity are real. The objective is to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves marks that never disappear. So, get ready for an intense story, full of twists and bitter truths. Are you ready? Because this story will shock you. David and Emily were the couple everyone admired. Together for almost 10 years, they built a life that seemed unshakable. He, a methodical man, always focused on stability, planning, and the security that a well-structured home could provide. She was lighter, more spontaneous, always with a ready smile, balancing her seriousness with sweetness. If someone were to observe them from the outside, they would see a solid marriage, based on respect and complicity. David worked in the financial sector, an environment that demanded precision and control, and he carried this into his personal life. I liked having everything in order, from the household finances to the most banal details of everyday life. Emily, on the other hand, possessed a more artistic soul. He loved taking photographs, capturing moments that he, sometimes, couldn't see. He had a different view of life, a more fluid way of looking at things. He saw life as a straight, well-paved road, where you plan your destination and follow it without detours. She saw life as a path full of unexpected curves, where the important thing was to enjoy the landscape. For years, this difference complemented them. But, little by little, it began to create invisible cracks. The routine arrived without asking for permission. At first, it just seemed like a natural fit of life together. The enthusiasm of the first experiences was being replaced by commitments, responsibilities, bills to pay, meetings, projects, deadlines. The sparkle in their eyes when they met at the end of the day became an automatic exchange of quick kisses and trivial questions about the day. In the beginning, it was romantic dinners on weekends, unexpected trips, small surprises that showed affection. But, over time, these moments became rarer, giving way to a more predictable, almost mechanical coexistence. David, always so dedicated to his work, began to bring more and more worries into the house. Not out of neglect, but because he felt his obligation was to guarantee a safe future for both of them. Emily, in turn, missed his attention, the likeness they used to have. He began to feel invisible, as if he were just another element of the house, and not the woman who was once loved so intensely. She tried to speak, tried to demonstrate, but the conversations were lost amidst the excuses. He said he was tired, that he needed to finish something important, that it wasn't a good time. She smiled, agreed, understood. Always understood. The nights became silent. Before, they loved watching movies together, discussing stories, laughing at absurd situations. Now, he arrived late, with his mind still tied to work. They ate dinner without much dialogue, and each one went about their nightly routine. Him, to the notebook. She, for her photographs. I tried to fill that void by recording beauties that I no longer felt in my own life. The room, once a refuge for both of them, became just a shared space. The touch became rarer, the desire faded. There were no fights, no heated arguments. Just silence. A silence filled with everything that was never said. Emily started going out more. She looked for friends, filled her days with exhibitions, coffees, conversations that made her feel alive. He noticed that he made less and less of a point of waiting for him. Before, I prepared elaborate dinners, left affectionate notes. Now, she was content to eat anything and lie down without worrying about whether he would arrive or not. David noticed the changes, but preferred to believe it was a phase. I didn't see any danger there. He trusted his wife, in the relationship they built. I thought love was enough to keep everything in place. But love is not just a feeling. Love needs presence. And he wasn't there. One afternoon, he arrived home early. A rare day, one of those moments when fate seemed to want to give things a chance to change. But Emily wasn't there. For the first time, he noticed something was different. He touched small details of the house that hadn't caught his attention before. New perfumes on her dressing table, dresses you never saw her wear, lipstick colors she never chose. He sat on the couch, trying to remember when was the last time he actually looked at his wife. He didn't just see her, he looked. He thought about the last conversations, the last times he made her laugh, the last times he hugged her without rushing. He tried to remember when was the last time he cared if she was happy. And he realized he didn't know how to answer. Emily came back that night different. Distant gaze, smile that seemed forced. He noticed. But he didn't say anything. Just watched. And for the first time, he felt afraid. Fear of what was happening before his eyes, without him noticing. Fear of missing something without even knowing exactly what it was. And, at that moment, he decided to pay more attention. But was there still time? David began to notice Emily's absences more closely. Small details that previously seemed irrelevant began to become pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to put together. At first, I tried to justify it. Maybe she was just busy, maybe she was spending more time with her friends, maybe she was just looking for something for herself. But something inside him screamed that it wasn't just that. He noticed that when she went out, she always checked her cell phone carefully beforehand. When he received messages, his expression changed, as if he was reading something he couldn't share. The schedules began to deviate from the routine they had. Before, Emily would come home at the same time, have dinner together, even in silence, but they would still be in the same space. Now, there were nights when she didn't even warn that she would be late, and when she asked, the answers were vague, distracted. And whenever she tried to bring up the topic, the feeling was that she wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. David's intuition was beginning to transform into something more concrete. He decided to test it. On one of the nights she said she was going out to meet a friend, he waited. He looked at the clock. It was past 11, midnight, 1 in the morning. Called. Call refused. Sent a message. No response. Something inside him began to burn, a tightness in his chest that mixed with anger and anguish. I felt like I was losing control of my own life. When Emily finally arrived, she walked through the door smiling, as if nothing was wrong. The perfume smell was too strong, different from what she wore. She didn't look directly at him when she entered, as if she purposely avoided his gaze. David didn't ask. Just watched. The next day, he decided to act differently. If she really was hiding something, it would give her the illusion that he was unsuspecting. Emily started going out more often. Always well-groomed, always with rehearsed excuses. What were once sporadic outings were now fixed commitments. Deep down, David was still trying to convince himself that he could be wrong, that maybe he was just creating stories in his own head. But then came the confirmation he feared. One night, while Emily was sleeping, he took her cell phone. Heart racing, breathing tense. He had never done that, never felt the need to invade his wife's privacy. But right there, at that moment, I needed to know. He unlocked the device with ease and started scrolling through messages. His name was there. A contact saved without a surname, but it didn't take much to understand what it meant. He opened the conversation and found what he didn't want to see. Messages exchanged at times when he was at home. Intimate words, promises, laughter, phrases that were once said to him. Photos. Declarations. The betrayal wasn't just physical. There was something more. An involvement that was already rooted, built, fed by months of lies. David felt the floor disappear. Betrayal wasn't just an isolated act, it wasn't a one-night mistake, it wasn't a slip-up. It was a choice. She chose to deceive him, she chose to build something with another man while he was there, in the same house, believing they still had a marriage. The blood boiled. He felt his stomach turn, the pain of seeing that everything he believed to be solid, everything he built, was just an illusion. He looked at Emily sleeping next to him, serene, peaceful, as if nothing was happening. As if nothing was being destroyed. He got up, went to the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror. That man I saw there was not the same as before. Something inside him was changing. The pain began to give way to something bigger, something that he still didn't know how to name, but that wouldn't let him be the loser in this story. He needed proof. I needed to know more. Emily still believed that he was oblivious, that he wasn't suspicious, and that worked in his favor. Over the next few days, David remained calm. He continued with his routine, without raising suspicion, without showing that he knew. But inside, every detail was analyzed. When she went out, he tracked the places he went. I kept every piece of information. On one of these nights, he decided to follow her. He drove slowly, keeping his distance, the headlights off. Emily parked near a discreet hotel, not very luxurious, but comfortable enough for those seeking discretion. He saw her get out of the car, fix her hair, and take one last look at the reflection in the window before getting in. The blood boiled. But he didn't move. Just waited. Time passed, and then the hotel door opened again. And there he was. The other man. Tall, confident posture, a satisfied smile on his lips as he looked around before getting into the car. David didn't need anything else. The betrayal was complete. It was no longer a doubt. It was real. It was in front of him, wide open, with no chance of denial. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling his fingers tingle. But now was not the time to act. Not yet. He had everything he needed. And now, he had control. When Emily returned home that night, she found David on the couch, watching television as if nothing had happened. He looked at her, showing no emotion. Just watched. Emily smiled, said she was tired and went straight to her room. David followed her with his eyes, feeling the weight of the truth he now carried. But she had no idea. And that was what made everything even more interesting. She still thought she had the power to lie. But the game was about to change. And she didn't even suspect it. David knew there was no point in acting in the heat of emotion. The betrayal had already happened, which meant his only advantage was to maintain control, to plan each step coolly. He would not be the man who would lose everything, who would emerge from this story as a loser. He wanted more than just a confrontation. I wanted something that would make Emily feel the weight of the choice she made firsthand. The worst part of cheating wasn't just the pain of being deceived, but the fact that the other person moved on, living as if nothing had happened. He wouldn't allow that. The following days were a kind of silent game. Emily continued with her lies, believing she still had the situation under control. David remained impassive, calculating every detail. Until the right moment finally arrived. One night he came home early, eerily calm. He found Emily distracted on the couch, looking at her cell phone, probably exchanging messages with her lover. He approached slowly, feeling the adrenaline rush through his veins. She didn't even look up until he stopped right in front of her. The tension in the air was evident. Emily smiled automatically, trying to appear calm, but there was something in David's expression that made her hesitate. He asked if he was okay, if something had happened. He didn't respond right away. He just placed his cell phone on the table and slid his finger across the screen until he opened the photos, messages, evidence of his infidelity. Emily froze. Her eyes scanned the screen quickly, as if trying to find some way out, some justification. Her breathing became ragged, her skin turned pale. He tried to speak, but his voice broke before any excuse could be formulated. David didn't look away, waiting. I wanted to see the truth appear on her face, I wanted to see her sink into the despair of her own lie. But Emily was fast. He caught his breath and began to deny it, saying that it was nothing, that everything could be explained. But he didn't want explanations. He wanted the truth, and this time, he wouldn't accept anything less. That was when, in an impulse of desperation, she tried to reverse the situation, tried to turn her own guilt into an accusation against him. He asked how he got that information, why he was spying, how he had the courage to touch her cell phone. As if he was to blame for discovering what she tried to hide. David's laugh was bitter. There was no more patience for manipulation games. He interrupted her with a coldness that made her shudder. There was no more room for pretense. I wanted her to say it out loud, to admit what she did. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily hesitated, took a deep breath, and then, for the first time, admitted. But not with an apology, not with genuine regret, but with the resignation of someone who has been cornered. He said yes, there was someone else. That he didn't plan it, that he didn't want to hurt him, but it happened. But the words were empty, artificial. As if he only said them because there was no other way out. David should have felt relief upon hearing the confession. But what came was a void. He already knew the truth, but hearing it from her, seeing in her eyes the lack of real guilt, the lack of genuine pain at having destroyed everything, was like a final blow. And it was there, at that moment, that he realized something. It wasn't just about the betrayal. There was something more. Something that had not yet been revealed. Because Emily still seemed to be holding on to something, one last secret she didn't want to tell. That's when he decided to take her to the limit. He asked directly. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know how far that lie went. Emily hesitated. She hadn't expected him to want more than a simple confession. And then, in the midst of despair, he blurted it out. The betrayal was not recent. It was not a passing adventure. It wasn't a mistake of a few months. She had been involved with this man for a long time, long enough that this wasn't just a slip-up. But the real blow came next. The secret David didn't expect. Emily's lover was not a stranger. It wasn't someone he had never met. This was someone who had been in your life for years, who was part of your story. Someone he trusted. He was your best friend. The betrayal wasn't just from the woman he loved. It was from the man he considered a brother. The person with whom you shared important moments, who you believed in, who helped you when you needed it. The shock was immediate. His heart raced, his hands shook. What was just a marital betrayal turned into something much bigger. Emily saw the impact her words had, she saw the change in his eyes and knew there was no going back. David felt short of breath. Everything he had experienced in recent years began to be reconstructed in his mind from a new perspective. Every moment, every encounter, every conversation. All the times they had dinner together, they laughed, they shared stories. Everything was a farce. He wasn't just sleeping next to a woman who cheated on him. He spent his days interacting with someone who deceived him while pretending to be his friend. Emily tried to speak, tried to justify. He said he never wanted it to be like this, that he never had the courage to tell him because he knew it would hurt him more than anything else. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Lies became unbearable. The weight of betrayal was too great to ignore. David looked at Emily as if he no longer recognized her. As if the woman he married had become a complete stranger. The silence between the two was an irreparable abyss. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath. Emily watched, waiting for some explosion, some violent reaction. But it didn't come. Just the coldest look she had ever seen. And then, he said the only thing that still made sense. That she didn't need to worry. That now, he knew everything. But what she didn't know, was that the game wasn't over yet. Emily remained still, feeling the weight of those words crashing down on her. Didn't you need to worry? How could he say that after everything that had been exposed? Her chest rose and fell in a frantic rhythm, as if desperately searching for some justification that could ease the devastation in David's eyes. But there was no justification. There was nothing she could say that would erase what she did. He knew everything. And now, he was looking at her as if she were nothing, a mistake, a waste of years. The only thing more devastating than someone's anger is indifference. And that was what she was beginning to feel from him. David looked away, walked slowly to the kitchen and filled a glass of water. His gestures were slow, calculated, as if he was holding something inside that couldn't be released yet. Emily followed him with her eyes, not daring to move. The silence between them was like a minefield, where any word could be the final explosion. But he didn't speak. He just took a sip of the water and then turned the glass between his fingers. As if that simple gesture was more interesting than the woman he once swore to love. She tried to break the barrier. I said his name softly, almost like a plea for mercy, but he didn't even react. Emily didn't know what to expect. He didn't yell, didn't confront her any more than he already had. And that made her even more nervous. If he had exploded, if he had broken something, if he had done anything rash, he would have been easier to deal with. But his coldness was a silent warning that what came next would be far worse than a simple outburst of anger. David finally broke the silence. He asked if she loved the other man. He asked like someone who already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it from her, wanted to see her struggle, wanted to feel the bitter taste of the truth being spat out by those lips that had so often said they loved him. Emily tried to dodge, but he didn't allow it. He said he wanted to hear it. He said he didn't want any more excuses or lies. Just the truth. Because if she wasn't able to say it now, then all that talk would have been for nothing. Emily swallowed. He hesitated. But in the end, he responded. I did not know. He said that what he felt was confusing, that there was no way to compare the two. That he didn't plan it, that it just happened. But with every word that came out of his mouth, David only confirmed what he already suspected. She had no remorse for what she did. She only had remorse for being discovered. He laughed, a short, humorless laugh, and said that was the most predictable answer she could have given. Emily shifted uncomfortably, feeling completely exposed. She tried to get closer, but he raised his hand, preventing any attempt at contact. He said he didn't want to be touched by her anymore. That privilege she had handed over to someone else. That now, everything that stood between them was the end. She insisted, tried to say that she didn't want them to end up like this, that wasn't what she wanted for them. But David just raised his eyebrow and asked if, at any point, she thought about him while she was with the other person. He asked her if she ever stopped and wondered how he felt during those hidden encounters. He wondered what would happen when everything came to light. Emily tried to respond, but the words died in her throat. Why no, she hadn't thought. And now, it was too late. David left the glass on the counter and walked to the door. He took the car keys and said he needed to leave. Emily was scared, afraid of what that meant. He asked where he was going. But he just replied that she would know soon. She stood there, alone in the room, feeling panic rising within her. She picked up the phone, thought about calling him, but something stopped her. Something in the look in his eyes before he left made her realize it wouldn't be that simple. And then, after minutes that felt like hours, the answer came. His phone vibrated on the table. A message. But not from David. On the other. The message was short, almost impatient. He wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to know if David knew. If she had said anything. Emily felt her heart speed up. She typed something quickly, saying she needed to talk to him in person. But before he could send it, the phone screen lit up again. A new message. But this time, it was David's. Emily felt her stomach drop when she opened it. It was not a conventional message. It was a photo. A photo of David sitting at a bar, facing someone. And that someone was the other man. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. David didn't go to a motel and destroy everything in a fit of rage. He didn't go to a friend's house to seek comfort. He went directly to him. The man she cheated on him with. The man he considered a brother. Emily called David immediately, but the call went to voicemail. Tried again. Nothing. She looked at the phone screen, at the photo, at David's cold smile next to the one that helped her destroy their marriage. What was he doing? What were you planning? Fear took over her. For the first time, he felt completely out of control. And then, as a final blow, David's last message arrived. You've made your choice. Now watch what happens next. Emily felt her entire body shudder. The phone was still shaking in his hands, the screen lit up with that last message from David, a cold, definitive sentence. You've made your choice. Now watch what happens next. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed to reverberate in her ears, drowning out anything else around it. The once familiar room suddenly felt like a strange space, a place where she no longer belonged. He walked from side to side, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to understand how far David would go. Called again. P.O. Box. He tried once again. Nothing. He typed desperate messages, but they all went unanswered. I felt like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. He was with the other one. And the worst part, he knew everything. He took the car key and left without thinking. She drove at high speed, without an exact destination, guided only by the instinct that she needed to prevent whatever was about to happen. The city passed her by in blurs of light and shadow, but her mind could only focus on one thing, David sitting before her, this man she had allowed into her life in a way that never should have happened. What were they talking about? What had he said? Did he know that, at that moment, Emily was on her way, trying to avoid something that could already be out of her control? When he arrived at the bar, he saw David's car parked across the street. His chest tightened. He didn't think twice before getting out of the vehicle and quickly crossing the sidewalk, almost tripping in his haste. His hands shook as he pushed the door open. The atmosphere was stuffy, full of scattered conversations and the smell of alcohol mixed with cigarettes. But none of that mattered. His eyes swept the space until he found them. There they were. David was sitting too relaxed, a calculated smile on his lips, while the other looked uncomfortable, his fingers tapping nervously against the glass of whiskey in front of him. Something was happening here, something much bigger than Emily could understand. The lover saw her first, and the look of panic that crossed his face was enough to make David smile even wider. She approached, her heart racing. David looked up at her, and in that instant, she knew he was already far ahead. This was not an impulsive meeting. He didn't go there without a plan. He wanted her to see. I wanted her to be there, witnessing whatever was about to happen. Emily called his name, almost voicelessly. David tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the scene with interest, before finally speaking. He asked her if she was surprised to find them there. He asked her if she really thought he would sit at home, accepting everything with his head down. The lover looked away, tense, the muscles in his face contracted in nervousness. She asked them to talk somewhere else, not to do that there, but David just smiled and asked why. After all, they weren't ashamed to meet so many times, to hide, to betray him while feigning loyalty. So why now, all of a sudden, should he care about preserving some kind of dignity for them? Emily looked at the other, waiting for him to say something, but he was in shock. He knew there were no arguments that would free him from that situation. David leaned back in his chair, twirling the glass between his fingers. He said he wasn't there to fight. I didn't want screams or scenes. It wasn't worth it. I already understood everything I needed. And, most importantly, he had already made his decision. She tried to argue, tried to ask them to get out of there, but David cut her off with frightening calm. She said that conversation wasn't about her. That, at that moment, she was just a spectator of her own mistake. Then he turned to the other man and asked if he knew what loyalty meant. The weight of someone's trust was understood. He asked what had gone through his mind every time he looked into his eyes while he slept with his wife. He asked if, at any point, he felt guilty or if he simply believed that it would never have consequences. The lover remained silent, without the courage to respond. David chuckled, shaking his head. He said that, deep down, he always knew that betrayals don't start with big events, but with small acts. Small character deviations. Little moments when someone chooses to put their own pleasure above all else. Emily flinched, feeling the impact of those words like a sharp blade piercing her chest. Then David took something from his pocket and placed it on the table. An envelope. The other looked suspicious. Emily felt panic rising in her throat. David smiled and said that there was all the evidence. The photos, the messages, the records. Everything printed, catalogued, irrefutable. The truth, naked and raw. Emily couldn't breathe. The other took the envelope with trembling hands, opened it and leafed through the contents. His face was transforming, panic taking over every feature. David waited patiently as he took in the reality. Then, finally, he spoke. He said he didn't want anything from that man. I didn't want excuses, I didn't want explanations. I just wanted him to know that his life would never be the same after that night. Because the moment he got up from that table, the moment he walked out that door, what was inside that envelope would become public. The lover's eyes widened, his breathing became short. Emily tried to intervene, but David completely ignored her. David stood up, straightened his jacket and said he had spent too much time at that table. That now, he had better things to do. Then he looked at Emily one last time. And in that look, she understood that she had lost everything. Without another word, David left, leaving behind the chaos he had painstakingly planned. And as Emily and her lover stood there, motionless, devastated by the weight of what had been done, the only thing that echoed in her mind was that David didn't look back. He would never look back. Emily remained seated, her breathing ragged, her eyes still fixed on the door through which David left. The surrounding environment seemed to slowly rotate, as if time had lost any real meaning. The envelope was still on the table, the papers scattered next to the lover's untouched glass of whiskey, who now had his hands pressed against his temples, trying to process the chaos that had just ensued. The bar continued to operate around them, voices and laughter seemed distant, oblivious to the disaster unfolding in front of them. Emily felt a lump in her throat, an irrational urge to run after David, but her legs were tied to the floor, heavy, unable to move. The other man finally raised his head, his eyes wide, furious and terrified at the same time. He threw the papers on the table with force, frustration written all over his face. He asked her what the hell David wanted with that, if he was just joking or if he really intended to ruin everything. Emily tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. The lover slammed his hand on the table, making the envelope slide a little, the papers becoming even more disorganized. He said he couldn't let that happen, that he needed to find out what David was planning. He leaned over the table, his fingers gripping the glass of whiskey so hard it felt like it was going to break. Emily blinked a few times, trying to reorganize her thoughts. She looked around, feeling the growing pressure of what would happen next. If David carried out his threat, everything would change. And not just for her. The other man had a lot to lose, much more than just a lover. And it was at that moment that Emily realized that, for the first time, he was only thinking about himself. Not in saving her, not in trying to find a solution for both of them. Just to avoid your own ruin. She took a deep breath and finally found the strength to speak. He said he didn't know what David would do, that he didn't know how far he would go. But as the words came out, something inside her twisted in despair. Because deep down, she knew exactly what would happen. David never made empty threats. Never. The lover stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair, pacing from side to side, muttering to himself, making mental calculations, imagining alternatives. Emily watched him, but she felt as if she were seeing a stranger. He didn't look at her, he didn't ask how she was, he didn't offer any kind of support. He was worried about himself. And in that instant, a brutal reality dawned on her: if David really exposed everything, he would simply leave her behind. Without hesitating. Emily felt something break inside her. All the nights of clandestine meetings, all the whispered promises, all the moments when he thought maybe he was feeling something real, everything fell apart in a matter of seconds. The man for whom she destroyed her marriage now only saw her as a burden, a problem to be solved. There was no love there. There never was. Her lover stopped walking and looked at her, his eyes filled with panic and irritation. He asked her what she intended to do, what her plan was to stop that. Emily let out a humorless laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in her chest. She asked if he really expected her to have a solution, after all. If he really thought she could simply reverse everything as if it were a small mistake, a failure without major consequences. He huffed, irritated, saying he didn't have time for sentimentality. They needed to act. Emily crossed her arms, watching him with a coldness she didn't know she possessed. He then asked what he intended to do. He hesitated, looked away. He tried to suggest that maybe David was still bluffing, that maybe he didn't have the courage to go through with it. But the uncertainty in his voice gave away that he didn't believe his own words. She realized what he wanted. He expected her to go after David. To beg, to cry, to do anything to make him give up. That, once again, she would solve everything for him. But Emily was no longer willing to be a shield. She slowly stood up, picked up her bag and looked into his eyes one last time. I told him to turn around. If he wanted to save his reputation, he would try to resolve this on his own. Because it was already destroyed. There was nothing left to save for her. And then, without waiting for a response, he turned and left the bar. The night felt too cold, or maybe it was just his own body that was in shock. Each step felt heavy, dragging, as if he were walking on broken glass. He looked around, expecting to see David's car, but it was no longer there. She picked up the phone, hesitated. I knew that any message would go unanswered. But still, he dialed. He heard the insistent ringing, like a sentence being read before the final punishment. Until finally, he answered. David's voice was calm, but filled with something impossible to decipher. He asked her what she wanted. Emily took a deep breath. Said he wanted to see him. There was a long silence on the other side. Then finally he said an address and hung up. She felt her stomach turn. He looked at the display, his heart racing. I recognized that place. And it was at that moment that I knew the worst was yet to come. She got into the car, driving without thinking, with just one goal, to get to him before everything was lost forever. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Maybe it was already too late. Emily drove at high speed, her fingers tight on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road in front of her. The night seemed darker than usual, and the weight of what was about to happen was suffocating her. The address David had given him was not unknown. It was an isolated place, a restaurant closed at that hour, an empty parking lot, a space where there would be no witnesses to what was about to be said. Fear was mixed with anxiety, but above all, there was a latent despair. I needed to get to him. I needed to understand what he really intended. But more than that, I needed to know if there was still something there that could be saved. When he parked, he saw that his car was already there. Her heart pounded against her chest, and she took a deep breath before exiting the vehicle. He walked hesitantly, his steps echoing on the asphalt. The restaurant door was ajar. He entered, feeling the heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. And then, he saw him. David was sitting at one of the tables in the center of the room, his face serene, but his eyes filled with something impossible to decipher. There was a bottle of wine on the table, 2 glasses, but only one was full. He didn't move when he saw her enter. Just waited. Emily approached slowly, not knowing exactly how to start. She sat across from him, hesitantly. The silence between the two was thick, filled with everything that had been broken. Emily tried to speak, but David raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that stopped her. He wanted to speak first. And when he finally began, his voice was low, steady, without any hesitation. He asked if she really thought that after everything, there could still be some return. He asked if, at any point, she thought there would be forgiveness. Emily swallowed. She tried to say that she didn't want forgiveness, she just wanted him to listen to her, to understand that it wasn't something she planned, that she didn't know how everything got to this point. But David smiled bitterly, shaking his head, as if he had heard all those excuses before. He said he no longer needed justification. There was no need for forced repentance. He just wanted her to know something very simple: he was leaving. Emily felt the floor disappear. He asked what he meant by that. But David was direct. He wouldn't stay in that city. I wouldn't stay in that life that had been destroyed. The divorce was already underway. He had already made all the preparations. And, more importantly, there was already someone waiting for him somewhere else. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. He asked if he was already with someone else, if it was all part of a plan to get revenge on her. But David just smiled sideways, without answering directly. He said that life has curious ways of showing new possibilities when you least expect them. And that, contrary to what she imagined, not all pain needs to be the end. Sometimes the destruction of something bad is just the beginning of something much better. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but fell silent. For the first time, he realized that David wasn't just reacting to the betrayal. He was already at another stage. He was already rebuilding himself. And nothing she said would change that. She looked at him, searching for something familiar, some spark of the man who once loved her. But he was no longer there. The David in front of him was someone different. Someone she no longer recognized. Then he got up, took the full glass, took one last sip and said that this was the last time they would see each other. And, without giving time for any response, he turned and left. Emily stood there, alone, feeling the weight of everything she had lost. She tried to breathe, but something inside her was suffocating. He tried to process it, but everything seemed to spin. The betrayal that once seemed like a distant mistake was now the final sentence of his own destiny. Outside, David got into the car, closed the door and took a deep breath. He looked in the rearview mirror one last time, seeing the restaurant behind him. Then it accelerated. His new beginning was just ahead. And Emily? She stood there, looking at the door through which he left, knowing that she would never see that man again. I would never hear his voice again. I would never feel his touch again. And worst of all, he would never have the chance to repair what he destroyed. End. If you've made it this far, leave your opinion on this story in the comments. What did you think of the ending? How would you have acted in the character's place? Subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this, and remember, this channel does not support betrayal. Thanks for watching and see you next time.